The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of grit and failure. It settled on everything, a fine ochre shroud, coating the thirsty clapboard buildings, the hitching posts, and the hopes of the people who called this parched corner of the territory home. For Eleanor Whitford, it tasted of the end. The sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity, baking the very air she breathed. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air was stale but blessedly cool. She clutched the small canvas pouch in her hands, the weight of its contents, both a comfort and a terror. It was the last of it. The last of the money her husband Robert had left, the last buffer standing between her children and utter destitution. "That's everything, then," Mrs. Whitford said. "Mr. Abernathy, the bank teller." He was a small man with a perpetually worried expression, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he peered at her over the polished oak counter. He avoided her eyes, instead focusing on the ledger as if the numbers held some profound, unshareable sorrow. I trust things will look up for you at the claim." Eleanor offered a smile that didn't reach her weary eyes. "Hope is the last thing to die, Mr. Abernathy, or so they say." She turned to leave her boots, making a soft, lonely sound on the floorboards. The pouch felt impossibly light. Outside, her two older children, 8-year-old Mary and 6-year-old Samuel, waited by the water trough with their baby sister Rose, who was shaded from the sun by Mary's small frame. They were good children, too quiet for their age, their faces already etched with a worry that belonged to adults. Seeing them, a fierce protective love surged through Eleanor, momentarily pushing back the tide of despair. This money would buy feed. It would buy time. It had to. She had just stepped onto the boardwalk, the brutal sunlight making her squint, when the world exploded into chaos. Two riders thundered down the main street, their horses kicking up clouds of choking dust. They wore burlap sacks over their heads, crude eye holes cut into the rough fabric. Before anyone could react, they had dismounted a shotgun in one man's hands, a Colt revolver in the other's. The man with the shotgun fired a blast into the sky, the sound cracking like a thunderclap in the oppressive heat. People screamed and scattered, diving for cover behind barrels and into alleyways. "Nobody moves," the shotgun wielder bellowed, his voice muffled by the sack. Eleanor froze, her body shielding the entrance to the bank. Her mind screamed for her to run to her children, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The second man, taller and leaner, shoved past her into the bank. Mr. Abernathy yelped in terror. The sounds from inside were sickening, the thud of a fist, the frantic scraping of coins being swept into a bag. The man outside kept his shotgun level, his hidden eyes scanning the street. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on her children, huddled by the trough. Mary had her arms wrapped around Samuel and Rose, her small body a rigid shield. Please God, let them not be seen. The robber emerged from the bank, a heavy sack slung over his shoulder. He was about to mount his horse when his partner's gaze fell on Eleanor. He strode toward her, his boots heavy on the boardwalk. She flinched, clutching her own small pouch of money to her chest. "What's that you got there, ma'am?" he rasped. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's all I have." He laughed, a cruel, grating sound. He didn't reach for the money. Instead, his gloved hand shot out and seized the front of her dress, his fingers closing around the delicate silver locket that hung from a chain around her neck. It had been Robert's last gift to her, given just before he'd taken ill. Inside were two tiny, impossibly precious portraits, one of him smiling and one of their wedding day. "No," she gasped, her hands flying up to protect it. "Please, not that." His grip was like iron. With a vicious tug, he ripped the chain from her neck, the silver links biting into her skin. The locket, her last tangible piece of a life that was gone forever, vanished into his fist. He didn't even glance at it. The act was swift, brutal, and strangely personal, as if he weren't just stealing an object, but erasing a memory. He shoved her backward, and she stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, swallowed by the dust of their own making. The street was silent for a moment, and the townsfolk slowly emerging from their hiding places, their faces pale with shock. Mr. Abernathy staggered out of the bank, a hand pressed to his bleeding lip. But Eleanor didn't see him. She saw only her children running toward her, their faces streaked with dust and tears. Mary reached her first. "Mama, are you hurt?" Eleanor knelt and pulled them into a desperate embrace, her body shaking. The pouch of money was still clutched in her hand, forgotten. The space on her chest where the locket used to rest felt like a cold, hollow wound. It wasn't just a robbery. It was a violation. And as she held her children, a new feeling began to smolder beneath her fear and grief, a cold, hard ember of resolve. They had taken more than a piece of silver. They had taken a piece of her heart. And she would find out why. The ride back to Whitford's claim was a journey through a dying land. The sun had scorched the earth to the color of old bone, and the skeletal remains of what should have been a summer pasture stretched out on either side of the trail. Her cattle, what few were left, stood listlessly near the dry creek bed, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. Eleanor's heart ached with every bony head that lifted in weary hope as she approached. Her ranch was a small, stubborn patch of defiance in a valley increasingly dominated by two colossal powers. To the west lay the vast, sprawling empire of Silas Blackwood, a man whose ambition was as boundless as the territory itself. His land was a testament to his ruthlessness, bought, bullied, and seized from smaller men who couldn't fight back. To the east, bordering her own property, was Hart's Ridge, the domain of Caleb Hartwell. His ranch was a different kind of power, old, established, and fiercely protected. It held the valley's lifeblood, the deep, inexhaustible Hart River, which flowed like a green ribbon through his land, mocking the drought that was killing everyone else. Blackwood had been circling Whitford's claim for months, like a vulture waiting for the final twitch. He was a man who wore charisma like a fine suit, his smile quick and his words smooth, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. Only a week ago, he had ridden out to her porch, his large frame blocking the sun. Eleanor, he had said, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he dismounted. "This is no life for a woman of your quality, or for these fine children." He gestured toward Mary and Samuel, who watched him with undisguised suspicion. "The land is turning against you. Let me take this burden from you. My offer is more than fair. It's a mercy." "My husband built this place with his own hands, Mr. Blackwood," she had replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is our home. It's not for sale." Blackwood's smile had tightened, the charm vanishing to reveal the steel beneath. "Pride is a luxury, my dear. One I suspect you can no longer afford. My offer won't stand forever." He had mounted his horse and ridden away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats hanging in the air. In stark contrast to Blackwood's predatory visibility, Caleb Hartwell was a ghost. Town gossip painted him as a man broken by some long-ago tragedy, a bitter recluse who had locked himself away on his magnificent ranch. They said he was unforgiving, that he had a heart of stone, and that he had turned his back on the world after a betrayal left him scarred. No one crossed onto Hart's Ridge without an invitation, and invitations were never issued. He was a myth, a cautionary tale whispered to children. The dark king of a green and inaccessible kingdom. This was Eleanor's world. A triangle of desperation with her at its fragile center, caught between a relentless aggressor and an unmovable ghost, fighting for the only spring in the region that hadn't yet run dry. But the bank robbery had changed the equation. The money she'd withdrawn, the money the robbers had ignored in their strange haste to take her locket, was now all she had. It wouldn't last the month. The true disaster revealed itself the next morning. Eleanor walked to the narrow creek that trickled down from the low hills, her last resort, now that her well was dangerously low. It was the only reason her small herd hadn't completely perished. But the creek was gone. Where there had been a sluggish but steady flow of water, there was now only a bed of damp, cracked mud. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She followed the creek bed upstream, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Half a mile from her property line, she found it a crude but effective dam of rock and timber, expertly wedged into the narrowest part of the ravine. The water pooled behind it, useless to her, a stagnant mirror, reflecting the empty blue sky. This was no act of nature. This was an attack. It was Blackwood's answer to her refusal. He hadn't just made a threat. He had signed her death warrant. She returned to the ranch house, her face a mask of grim resolve. Her cattle were lowing a mournful, thirsty sound that tore at her soul. Inside, Samuel coughed a dry, hacking sound. Mary was rationing what little water was left from the well, her small face set in a look of intense concentration. There was no more time. There were no other options. Pride, Blackwood had said, was a luxury. He was right. Her children's lives were not. With trembling hands, she saddled her old mare, a creature nearly as weary and bone-thin as she was. Mary watched her from the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Where are you going, Mama?" "I'm going to see a man about some water," Eleanor said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. She was going to do the one thing everyone in the valley knew you did not do. She was going to ride to Hart's Ridge. She was going to confront the formidable, ghost-haunted Caleb Hartwell and beg for a piece of his river. She was going to knock on the door of a man she had been warned at all costs to avoid. The ride to Hart's Ridge was an ascent into another world. The moment Eleanor crossed the unmarked boundary, the cracked beige earth gave way to hardy grasses. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The sound of the Hart River was a low, constant murmur in the distance, a promise of life that felt like a personal affront to the suffering in the valley below. Caleb Hartwell's house was not a cabin, but a fortress built of thick, dark logs and solid riverstone perched on a rise that gave it a commanding view of all he owned. It was a house built to keep the world out. Eleanor's mare, smelling the nearby water, tried to pull toward the river, but Eleanor held the reins tight. Her knuckles were white. Her desperation had propelled her this far, but now standing before the immense silent house, a wave of pure terror washed over her. The stories, the whispers, the warnings, they all converged in this moment. She was a trespasser, a beggar, at the court of a reclusive king. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she dismounted and walked to the heavy oak door. She raised a fist that felt as heavy as lead and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the sheer size of the house, by the vast, intimidating silence of the ridge. For a long moment, nothing happened. She was about to knock again, her courage failing, when the door swung inward with a low groan. Caleb Hartwell was taller than she had imagined, his shoulders broad enough to fill the entire doorway. He wasn't the wild-eyed madman of the town's tales, but something far more unsettling, a man encased in stillness. His face was stern, handsome, in a severe, weathered way, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke not of age, but of immense pressure. Those eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fixed on her with an unnerving, unreadable intensity. He said nothing, simply stood there waiting his silence, a wall more formidable than stone. Eleanor swallowed the lump of pride and fear in her throat. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Eleanor Whitford. My land borders yours to the east." She paused, hoping for some flicker of acknowledgement, but there was none. "I need water." The words came out blunt, stripped of all pleasantry by the urgency of her mission. His gaze swept over her, taking in her dusty clothes, the fraying cuffs of her dress, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. His expression remained unchanged, cold and impenetrable. "The river is on my land," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed unused to speech. "The law is clear. It was a dismissal, absolute and final. The coldness of his reply shocked her, but it also ignited a spark of defiance. She was not just fighting for herself. She lifted her chin, her own eyes flashing. The law won't keep my children from starving. She countered, her voice gaining strength. Silas Blackwood has dammed the creek. It was my only other source. My well is nearly dry. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out the small pouch of money from the bank. It seemed a pathetic offering. I'm not asking for charity. I can pay for access for whatever you think is fair. He cut her off, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not interested in your money. He took a half step back, his hand resting on the edge of the door, as if preparing to close it. The world is full of people who make promises they can't keep. I learned that lesson a long time ago. The words were clipped, each one a stone laid on the wall between them. They hinted at a deep old wound, but offered no explanation. The answer is no. The door began to close. Panic seized Eleanor. She saw the faces of her children in her mind, Mary's stoicism, Samuel's rattling cough, Rose's innocent trust. She couldn't fail. Please. The word was torn from her, a raw cry that shattered the tense quiet. It's not for me. It's for my children. Their lives depend on it. Whatever happened to you, whatever lesson you learned, my children had no part in it. They are innocent. He paused, the door held open by a mere crack. Through it, his stormy eyes bored into hers. For an agonizing second, the silence stretched thick with the weight of his past and her future. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, not pity, but a shadow of a pain that recognized her own. It was there and then gone so quickly, she thought she might have imagined it. He said nothing more. The heavy oak door swung shut with a resounding thud, the bolt sliding home with a final metallic click. Eleanor was left standing on his porch alone. With the murmur of the river, she could not have the echo of his refusal ringing in her ears. Defeated, she stood there for a long time, trembling not from cold, but from a rage born of helplessness. Then slowly she turned and walked back to her horse. The fight was not over. It had just begun. Eleanor returned to a house of deepening shadows. The water in the well was now a shallow, muddy puddle, thick with a sickness she could taste in the air. She boiled every drop, but she knew it was a losing battle. Hope was a dwindling resource, scarcer even than water. But the image of that crude dam, the cold finality in Caleb Hartwell's eyes, and the ghost of her stolen locket coalesced into a hard knot of determination in her chest. She would not be broken. The next day, she rode back to the dammed creek, this time with a purpose. She dismounted and began a slow, meticulous search of the area, her eyes scanning the disturbed earth. Her husband, Robert, had been a cautious man, and he had taught her to read the land, to see the stories left behind in broken twigs and displaced stones. Near the base of the dam, half hidden under a loose pile of rocks, she found it a boot print. It was deep and clear, in a patch of drying mud, the mark of a heavy man. But what made her breath catch was the unique detail on the heel, a small, crescent-shaped piece of metal, likely a custom repair that left a distinctive scar on the earth. She spent an hour sketching it carefully in a small notebook. She kept her fingers tracing the curve of the crescent. It was a clue. It was proof. But it was not enough. She spent the next few days in Redemption Gulch, watching, listening. She traded 2 of her laying hens for a sack of flour and some dried beans, the transaction feeling like another small surrender. While at the mercantile, she saw him. A hulking man with a sullen face named Jed, one of Silas Blackwood's most loyal enforcers. He was leaning against the general store's porch railing, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. As he shifted his weight, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to his boots. They were old and scuffed, but on the heel of his right boot, caked in mud, but still visible, was the unmistakable gleam of a crescent-shaped metal plate. A cold certainty settled in her stomach. She knew. Blackwood had sent this man. But knowledge was not power. Accusing a man like Blackwood without unshakable proof was a fool's errand, an invitation for a much faster, more final ruin. The crisis she had feared arrived that evening. Samuel, who had been listless all day, developed a raging fever. His cough grew worse, a deep rattling sound that tore through the quiet cabin. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and when he cried for water, his voice was a weak, rasping whisper. It was the well water. She had boiled it, but it hadn't been enough. The poison was in the mud, in the dregs of their survival. Panic, stark and absolute, clawed at her throat. The town doctor was a day's ride away, a journey Samuel would not survive. There was only one other option. One last desperate gamble, leaving Mary in charge with a solemn set of instructions and a kiss on her forehead. Eleanor wrapped a feverish Samuel in their thickest blanket, lifted his limp body onto her mare, and rode. She didn't ride toward town. She rode back up the trail to Hart's Ridge this time, not as a beggar, but as a mother, pushed past the point of pride or fear. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, leaving veins of dust where life used to be, but she barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the small, hot body in her arms. She didn't knock on Caleb Hartwell's door this time. She pounded on it with both fists, her cries raw and ragged. "Hartwell, open this door. My son is dying." The door was wrenched open, and Caleb stood there, his face a thunderous mask of anger at the intrusion. "I gave you my answer." He began, his voice a low growl. "I am not here for your water," she cried, shoving past him into the cool interior of his home. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made him take an involuntary step back. She held out her son. "I am here for his life. He's sick from bad water your neighbor saw fit to deny me. I need clean water and medicine, and I will not be turned away." Caleb's gaze fell upon the child. Samuel's head lolled against Eleanor's shoulder, his breaths coming in shallow, painful gasps. The anger on Caleb's face faltered, replaced by that same haunted shadow she had seen before, only this time it was deeper, more profound. He looked at the sick boy, and for a split second his vision seemed to blur, superimposing another, smaller face onto Samuel's. He flinched, his jaw tightening as if against a physical blow. Without a word, he turned and strode toward the kitchen. "Bring him in. Lay him by the fire." His tone was still gruff, but the hard edge of dismissal was gone, replaced by a grudging urgency. Eleanor carried Samuel to the stone hearth and gently laid him on a thick bearskin rug. Caleb returned with a basin of cool, clean water from his well and a small wooden box of medical supplies. He moved with a surprising tenderness, his large, calloused hands gentle as he bathed the boy's forehead and forced a few drops of a bitter tincture between his lips. He worked with a quiet competence, a man acting not out of kindness, but from a deep, ingrained sense of duty that seemed to war with his desire for isolation. As Eleanor watched him, she saw past the fearsome recluse to the man beneath. She saw the flicker of humanity breaking through his carefully constructed armor. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by Samuel's labored breathing and Caleb's quiet instructions. As he tended to the boy, Eleanor's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece. There, half hidden behind a stack of books, was an old faded photograph in a simple wooden frame. It was a picture of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a little girl of about 5, her dark pigtails tied with ribbons. They were posed by a creek, the sun in their hair. "Who are they?" she asked softly, unable to stop herself. Caleb, who had been measuring out another dose of medicine, froze. His back went rigid. When he turned to face her, his eyes were once again stormy and distant. "They are the reason I learned my lessons about the world," he said, his voice flat and cold. He picked up the photograph and, without looking at it, placed it face down on the mantel. "He'll be through the worst of the fever by morning. You can have all the clean water you can carry. Then you should go. The wall was back up higher and colder than before. But Eleanor had seen the crack in it. She had seen the ghost he was haunted by. A few days later, her son on the mend Eleanor was in town for supplies when she saw Blackwood talking to Jed by the smithy. She kept her distance, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico in a shop window. Blackwood clapped Jed on the shoulder, a wide predatory grin on his face. "Don't you worry about the Whitford woman," Blackwood said, his voice carrying on the dry breeze. "That family has a debt to pay, and I aim to collect. We're going to settle a score that started a long time ago. A score that started at Crimson Creek." Crimson Creek. The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but the venom in Blackwood's tone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just about her land. It was something more. Something older and deeper. Something tied to her family, a debt she knew nothing about. Returning home, her mind swirled with the new puzzle pieces, a crescent-shaped boot print, a faded photograph of a lost family, and the cryptic mention of a place called Crimson Creek. Her fight for water was becoming something else entirely. It was a fight for the truth. The truth was buried in the past, locked away in a place she never thought to look. With Samuel sleeping peacefully, his fever finally broken, a desperate thought seized Eleanor. Robert had left so little behind, but perhaps there was something she had missed, something of value she could sell for more time. She went to the old trunk at the foot of her bed, the one that held her husband's few worldly possessions, a spare shirt, his father's worn Bible, a set of whittling knives. Her fingers traced the worn leather and brass fittings. She had been through it a dozen times. There was nothing. Defeated, she started to close the lid when her knuckles brushed against a slight unevenness in the cedar bottom. Puzzled, she ran her hand over it again. A thin line, almost invisible. Using one of the whittling knives, she pried at the edge. With a soft click, a false bottom lifted away, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, nestled in the dark, hollow space, was a single leather-bound journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted it out, the leather cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingers. Robert had never been a man for letters or writing. She never knew he kept a journal. With a sense of both reverence and dread, she opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar slanted script. The first few entries were mundane notes on fences, tallies of cattle worries about the weather. But then, the entries changed. They became furtive, filled with names and places she did not recognize. And then she saw them written in stark black ink: Caleb Hartwell, Silas Blackwood, Crimson Creek Silver Mine. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her eyes devouring the words her husband had hidden from her, from everyone. October 1878. One entry read, "Success. Caleb was right about the vein. The assay report is better than we ever dreamed. Hartwell, Blackwood, and Whitford were going to be the richest men in the territory. Caleb is a force of nature, a true friend. Blackwood. His eyes gleam with a hunger that frightens me. He sees the silver, but I fear he doesn't see the partnership." Eleanor's breath hitched. Her husband, her quiet, unassuming Robert, had been partners with the two most powerful men in the valley. He had never spoken a word of it. She read on her sense of reality, unraveling with every page. The journal painted a vivid picture, the three men friends bound by a shared dream, working the small but incredibly rich silver mine at a place called Crimson Creek. Caleb was the heart of the operation, the experienced miner and leader. Robert was the numbers man handling logistics and supplies. Blackwood was the money, the one with the connections to get their ore to the smelters. Then the tone of the journal shifted. Falk, November 1878. Blackwood grows more dangerous. He speaks of cutting our shares, of bringing in his own men. He says Caleb is too cautious, that I am too soft. Caleb confronted him today. The anger between them was so thick you could choke on it. I tried to be the peacemaker, but I fear I am just a blade of grass between two great stones. The final entries were written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. That's December 5th, 1878. God help us. Blackwood tried to cheat us. He falsified the shipping manifests. Caleb found out. He's going to expose him. Blackwood threatened him, threatened us all. He's mad with greed. Catherine and little Lily are visiting the camp this week. Caleb is worried for their safety. I am too. Something terrible is going to happen. I can feel it. The last entry was dated December 7th. It's done. Blackwood brought in his own blasting crew. He said he was speeding up the process. Caleb said it was reckless that the northern tunnel was unstable. They fought. I saw the look in Blackwood's eyes. This isn't about silver anymore. It's about ruin. I have to do something. I can't stand against him, but I can't stand with him either. There is a great weight on my soul, and that was it. The journal ended. There was no mention of a cave-in, no explanation of what came next. But Eleanor knew. She looked up from the book and the cabin around her, seeming alien and strange. The idealized image of her husband, the simple, honorable rancher, had been shattered. He had been part of a dark, terrible secret. And that secret had not died. It was here now, choking the life from her land and threatening her children. Her fight was no longer for water. It was for the truth of what happened at Crimson Creek. Armed with her husband's words, she knew she had to face Caleb Hartwell one more time. This time she would not be begging for mercy. She would be demanding answers. The journal felt like a block of ice in her hands as she rode back to Hart's Ridge. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm. When Caleb opened the door, his face was set in its usual hard lines, but he seemed surprised to see her alone. "The boy," he asked, his voice low. "He's recovering." "Thank you," she said, her own voice devoid of warmth. She held up the journal. "We need to talk. You knew my husband, Robert Whitford." It was not a question. Caleb's composure finally broke. His eyes widened in shock and a muscle feathered in his jaw. He stared at the leather-bound book as if it were a ghost. Silently, he stepped aside and let her in. She followed him to the main room where a low fire crackled in the hearth. The faded photograph on the mantel was still face down. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. He kept it hidden. He kept everything hidden. She opened the journal to the last entry and handed it to him. "Tell me what happened, Caleb. Tell me the truth." He took the book, his large hands surprisingly gentle, as they held the fragile pages. He read the final, desperate words his friend had written. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him, the sound of a man who had held his breath for 5 years. He sank into a heavy armchair by the fire, the journal resting on his knees. The formidable wall he had built around himself crumbled, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the raw, unending grief that lay beneath. "We were more than partners." He began, his voice thick with memory. "We were brothers. Robert Silas and me. We were going to build an empire." He told her everything. He spoke of the silver of Blackwood's consuming greed and of the final terrible argument. Blackwood's men set the blast in the North Tunnel, just as Robert wrote. I told them it was suicide, that the shale was unstable. Blackwood just laughed. He said I was a coward. Caleb's eyes grew distant, lost in the horror of the memory. My wife, Catherine, and my daughter, Lily. They had come up to the camp to surprise me for my birthday. They were in the mine office, not 50 yards from the tunnel entrance. His voice broke. The blast was bigger than anyone expected. It didn't just clear rock, it brought the whole mountain down. The ground shook, and then there was just silence. The office was gone, buried under 1,000 tons of rock. Tears tracked silently down his weathered cheeks. Blackwood claimed it was a tragic accident. People believed him. And Robert? Robert was gone. He vanished. I thought he ran. I thought he was a coward who couldn't face what happened, what our greed had led to. Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with 5 years of banked fury and pain. I have spent every day since then blaming both of them. Blackwood for his greed and your husband for his cowardice. For leaving me to bury my family alone. Eleanor stood speechless, the terrible truth of the past washing over her. The ghost on the mantel had a name. Catherine. The little girl was Lily. And Silas Blackwood had killed them. Her return home was a daze. The world felt muted, unreal. She staggered into her small cabin, her mind reeling from Caleb's story. And then she saw it. The front door was slightly ajar. A cold dread worse than anything she had felt before washed over her. "Mary," she called out, her voice trembling. "Samuel." Samuel ran out from the bedroom, his face pale with terror. Rose toddling behind him, crying. "Mama, a bad man came. He took Mary." On the simple wooden table in the center of the room lay a folded piece of paper. With numb fingers, Eleanor opened it. The handwriting was an elegant, cruel script she recognized instantly as Blackwood's. "Mrs. Whitford, you have been digging where you don't belong. Some histories are best left buried. I am prepared to forgive this trespass in exchange for a simple business transaction. Your daughter for the deed to your land. Leave it on the sundial in the center of town by noon tomorrow. If you go to the sheriff, your daughter will pay the price for your husband's past failures." The note was weighted down by something small and silver. Her locket. He had left it behind a final sadistic twist of the knife. He wasn't just taking her daughter. He was stripping away her past piece by piece until nothing was left. The land, the memories, the children, all of it. The time for investigation and quiet desperation was over. Blackwood had made his final move, and in doing so had started a war. A storm was brewing both on the horizon and within Eleanor's soul. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. A terrifying calm settled over her. She left Samuel and Rose with a neighbor, a kind woman she trusted, with a quiet instruction to send for the sheriff if she wasn't back by sunrise. Then she saddled her mare and rode like the wind, not toward town, but back toward Hart's Ridge. She showed Caleb the note. He read it, his face turning to granite. The grief in his eyes was replaced by a cold, lethal fire. "I know where he'll be." Caleb set his voice a low growl of promised retribution. The place where it all started. He didn't have to say the name. Crimson Creek. They rode together, 2 figures silhouetted against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind began to howl, kicking up curtains of sand that stung their faces and reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. The world was dissolving into a maelstrom of dust and fury, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come. The entrance to the Crimson Creek mine was a dark, gaping maw in the side of a scarred mountain, and the timbers around it groaning under the assault of the wind. A lone horse was tied nearby, Blackwood's prized black stallion. They dismounted Caleb, pulling a rifle from his saddle scabbard. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the shriek of the storm. They entered the mine. The air was cold and still smelling of damp earth and forgotten tragedies. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows down the main tunnel, making the support beams look like the ribs of some great dead beast. In a chamber just ahead, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, they saw him. Silas Blackwood stood with his back to a rock wall, one arm clamped around Mary, who struggled weakly against his grip. A pistol was pressed to her temple. "I knew you'd come." Hartwell Blackwood snarled, his handsome face twisted into a mask of manic glee. Always so predictable. "And you brought the widow. How fitting." A reunion of the families. Let the girl go, Silas. Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm as he raised the rifle. This is between you and me. Oh, it's between all of us, Blackwood laughed, a high, unhinged sound. She started this digging up the past, just like her weakling of a husband always meddling. He tightened his grip on Mary, who whimpered in fear. Drop the rifle, Caleb, or the girl dies right now. Caleb slowly lowered the weapon, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. Eleanor's heart felt like it would pound its way out of her chest. She had to do something. Her eyes darted around the cavern, taking in the precarious stacks of old crates, the rusting minecart on its tracks, the network of rotting timbers holding up the ceiling. She remembered a line from Robert's journal, a note about the instability of the north tunnel, and a specific warning about the main support beam in this very chamber. Why are you doing this? Silas, Caleb asked, trying to buy time. The silver is gone. The past is dead. What more do you want? Blackwood's face contorted with a sudden blazing rage. His carefully constructed facade of the charming land baron fell away completely, revealing the tormented soul beneath. Dead. It's not dead for me. It will never be dead. He screamed, his voice echoing off the rock walls. You want to know why I want this worthless piece of land? Why I've tormented this woman? Because you took everything from me. He gestured wildly with the pistol. You think you were the only one who lost someone in that cave-in? The woman who died that day, your precious Catherine, wasn't just your wife. She was my baby sister. The revelation struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. What? She was my sister, Blackwood. Shrieked, tears of fury streaming down his face. She wrote to me, told me how obsessed you were, how reckless you were becoming. I came here to get her out, to take her away from you and your madness and your ambition. Your damnable recklessness got her killed. You and that sniveling coward Whitford, who was too weak to stand up to you. You both killed her. His entire campaign against Eleanor, the pressure, the dam, the robbery, it had never been about the land. It was a twisted, agonizingly slow act of revenge aimed at destroying the families of the two men he held responsible for his sister's death. As Blackwood raged, lost in his own grief, Caleb's mind cleared. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. You're wrong, Silas, he said, his voice filled with a sudden profound certainty. Robert wasn't a coward. He ran. Blackwood spat. No, Caleb said, taking a deliberate step forward. He rode for the sheriff. I found his horse miles from here weeks later. He was carrying proof of your fraud, proof that you were endangering the mine. He wasn't running away. He was trying to save us all. This final truth seemed to shatter what was left of Blackwood's sanity. With a roar of denial, he shoved Mary away from him and raised his pistol to fire at Caleb. In that split second, everything happened at once. Caleb lunged forward, pushing Eleanor and Mary to the ground, as a shot rang out, the bullet striking him high in the shoulder and spinning him around. As he fell, Eleanor reacted. Fueled by adrenaline and a mother's fierce instinct, she scrambled to her feet and shoved the heavy, rust-eaten minecart with all her might. It groaned, its wheels scraping on the track, and rolled directly into the main support beam Robert had warned about in his journal. There was a deafening crack, and the world seemed to groan. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The beams splintered, and a section of the roof gave way, a cascade of rock and earth, burying Blackwood's legs and pinning him to the floor. He screamed, a sound of agony and final defeat. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed Mary and pulled her toward the mine entrance as the groaning of the timbers grew louder. She helped a wounded Caleb to his feet, and together the three of them stumbled out into the raging sandstorm, just as the wail of the wind was joined by another sound, the thunder of approaching horses. The sheriff and his posse, alerted by her neighbor, had arrived. In the days that followed the storm, a fragile quiet descended upon the valley. The wind scoured the land clean, and the sun rose on a world irrevocably changed. Silas Blackwood was in custody, his legs shattered. But his life spared his empire of greed and vengeance, already beginning to crumble under the weight of his crimes. Caleb was recovering at his ranch. The sheriff's bullet had been a clean shot through the shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. Eleanor and her children stayed at Hart's Ridge to help care for him. The vast, silent house was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of Samuel's laughter and Rose's tentative footsteps. The dam on the creek had been removed by the sheriff's men, and the water, clear and life-giving, once again flowed onto Whitford's claim. One afternoon, Eleanor found Caleb sitting on his porch, staring out at the river, his arm in a sling. She brought him a cup of coffee and sat in the chair beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared space of understanding. "He was my husband," Eleanor said softly, breaking the quiet. "I loved him, but I never really knew him." Caleb turned to look at her, his stormy eyes clear and filled with a deep, weary sadness. "He was my friend," he replied, "and I judged him wrongly. We were all flawed men, Eleanor, blinded by our own hopes and fears." They sat together, acknowledging the painful truths of their shared history of the flawed men they had both loved in their own ways. There was no talk of the future, no rushed attempt to fill the void their losses had left. There was only the slow, steady foundation of a deep and profound mutual respect, forged in the crucible of truth and survival. Months passed. The harsh grip of drought and winter loosened, and a tentative spring breathed new life into the valley. The grasses on Whitford's claim grew thick and green, nourished by a formal water-sharing agreement Eleanor had drawn up with Caleb. Her cattle were healthy, her children were thriving, and she was no longer seen in town as a destitute widow, but as a respected landowner, a woman who had faced down a tyrant and won. She and Caleb had become partners, first in business, and then slowly and naturally in life. Their bond was not one of fiery passion, but of quiet strength built on the solid ground of shared grief and hard-won trust. One evening, while rereading Robert's journal, searching for a kind of peace, a loose page she had never noticed before fluttered out from the back cover. It was a letter written in his hand, dated the morning of the cave-in. "My dearest Eleanor." It began, "If you are reading this, it means I have failed. I am writing for the law. I cannot stand by and watch Blackwood's greed consume a good man like Caleb or endanger the woman and child he loves. What we have done at Crimson Creek has become a stain on my soul, and I must try to wash it clean. I pray you can forgive my silence and my part in all of this. Everything I have done for you and the children. Forgive me. Your loving husband, Robert." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words that finally absolved the ghost of her husband's cowardice. She showed the letter to Caleb. He read it, and a peace she had never seen before settled over his features. The next Sunday, they all walked to the small grassy hill overlooking both their ranches, where a simple wooden cross marked Robert's grave. In his hand, Caleb held the silver locket recovered from Blackwood's possessions by the sheriff. He handed it to her. For a moment, Eleanor's fingers traced the familiar engraving. It was a beautiful thing, a relic of a life that felt a lifetime away. But it was a relic of the past. Instead of putting it on, she knelt and gently placed it on the mound of earth beneath the cross. "Rest now, Robert," she whispered. Then she stood, and Caleb took her hand. Together they walked a few paces to a simple, unmarked cairn of stones that stood nearby the makeshift grave marker for Catherine and Lily. Without a word, Eleanor bent down, picked up a smooth gray river stone, and placed it on the pile. Caleb did the same. This symbolic act was a quiet promise, an offering of forgiveness, the closing of a painful chapter, and the laying of a new foundation for the future. They stood there for a long time, Eleanor, Caleb, and the children, a new family forged in hardship and truth, looking out at the greening valley below. The setting sun bathed the two ranches now joined as one in a warm, golden light.